Hello and welcome all to SMPTE Hollywood Chapter's event, our meeting. This is our first Zoom webinar in the evening. I'm Linda Rossner, Chair of Hollywood Chapter of SMPTE, and I just want to thank everybody that is attending and all of our wonderful panelists. I'm going to now move it over to Greg Ciaccio, and again, thank you all for attending. We are thrilled to have all of you with us. Greg.
Thank you, Linda, and welcome everyone to our first full evening virtual webinar for SMPTE Hollywood. Before we start, let's take care of some housekeeping tips. At the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a Q&A button. This is where you're going to ask your questions. Please use this instead of the chat. My co-pilot, Brian Gaffney, will be fielding your questions, so please feel free to participate. We'll be stopping now and then, so there should be plenty of time to answer questions. Well, onto our program. Most of you have heard or read about the MovieLabs 2030 Vision White Paper, which codifies and helps to define the future of filmmaking. MovieLabs has recently produced additional documents focusing on software-defined workflows and content security. Today, we have the CTO of MovieLabs with us to talk about this evolution, and we'll also converse with two studio creative technologists to get a practical perspective on how these changes are being adopted since COVID has accelerated this transition. And now on to our three guests. Jim Helman, CTO MovieLabs, leads a range of projects focused on production technology and content security. On behalf of MovieLabs and its member studios, he has spearheaded initiatives to establish worldwide standards for high dynamic range video and the development of the Entertainment Identifier Registry, or EIDR. He has an extensive background in software architecture, engineering, and real-time 3D graphics. Helman holds PhD and master degrees in applied physics from Stanford University and a Bachelor of Arts in Physics and Math from Washington University. Next, we have Annie Chang. Annie's the Vice President of Creative Technologies for Universal Pictures and is responsible for developing strategies and designing innovative next-generation workflows across film and emerging immersive media experiences. Prior to joining Universal, Chang was the VP Technology for Marvel Studios and held various roles during more than a decade tenure at the Walt Disney Studios. Chang is the ACES project chair and co-chair of the Academy of Motion Picture. It's a mouthful. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences SciTech Council, SciTech. She has been a co-chair of the 10E Essence Technology and chair of the Interoperable Master Format, or IMF, working group at SMPTE. She is a SMPTE Fellow and is a recipient of the SMPTE Workflow Systems Medal Award, Advanced Imaging Society's Distinguishing Leadership Award, and Studio Daily's 2018 Exceptional Women in Post-Production, or Production and Post-Production. In 2020, The Hollywood Reporter named Chang on their list of top Hollywood innovators. Welcome, Annie. Lastly, we have Daniel De La Rosa. Daniel is Vice President of Post-Production for Sony Pictures Entertainment Technology Development Team. His current role encompasses technology and innovation strategy focused on film production advances, including virtual production, next-generation cloud-based production tools and workflows, post-production technologies, HDR color pipelines, AI and machine learning, and virtual reality and other immersive storytelling technologies. Prior to Sony, De La Rosa worked briefly at Universal Studios and at similar capacities at Walt Disney Studios. He is the recipient of a Television Academy Daytime Emmy Award and an Advanced Imaging Society Lumiere Award. Well, welcome everyone. Got that out. So before we dive too deeply into software-defined workflows, which is one of the most recent papers, I'd like to call on Jim Helman to briefly talk about the MovieLabs 2030 initiative. Jim?
I guess it would help if I turned my mic on. So thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. Yes, I just want to give just a quick little bit of background on the 2030 vision for those who may not be familiar with it, or maybe some of the more recent developments. So we put out this evolution of media creation white paper just before IBC in 2019, back when we actually could have IBC in person. It was developed with the studio production technology executives, two of whom I'm privileged to share the stage with here tonight. And it basically lays out 10 principles for building the future of production, kind of motivated by the changes in production technology, real-time engines, the movement to the cloud, which we've seen somewhat accelerated with the COVID production challenges, enabling collaboration, working from anywhere, iteration, and also securing this new model. So if you want, you can go to that URL and find the white paper. The 10 principles are divided up into 3 areas: kind of cloud fundamentals, security and access, and then software-defined workflows, which I think we'll be focusing on for the most part on tonight's panel. In 2019, we actually that's the wrong date. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Okay, then in 2020, in October, we put out a follow-on white paper, specifically kind of double-clicking on the principles in that 3rd category, in the workflow category. And it really tries to make the case for common data models, ontologies, and basically things that would lay the foundation for these software-defined workflows and interoperability among all the components. But basically wanting to try to move from kind of a very bespoke integration between all of the different tools and stages in production to something that may be a little bit less fragile, maybe more flexible, easier to replace tools and components in. And so this concept of a software-defined workflow kind of really underlies all of that. And our definition is basically a workflow that uses a highly configurable set of tools and processes to support creative tasks by connecting them through software-mediated collaboration and automation. So we're not just focused on the automation side. It really is about enabling the creative process and all of the collaboration that needs to happen in it. If you look at a workflow, today, all the different pieces, there's a lot of manual communication that happens. Some things are automated to some extent, but we'd really like to move to a future where maybe some of these interfaces are more standardized. It seems that having a common message bus and infrastructure underneath that allows different parts of a workflow to communicate better is something that could be a big improvement. If we can standardize some of these interfaces, if not completely at the API level, at least on a data model level, so that it's easier to connect and shim a lot of these different pieces. So that's just laying a little bit of a foundation, I think, for some of the directions that we're going. There's also a whole security aspect to all of this, which we can get into a little bit later if there's time. So with that, Greg, do you want to go ahead and kick off the Q&A and get going?
Sure. Yeah, actually, and that security, that paper was just published like yesterday, right?
Yeah, actually, hot off the presses. We did a follow-on white paper back in 2019 that kind of laid out the needs for a new security architecture. I can talk about that a little bit if you'd like. And then just yesterday, we published the first 3 parts of a security architecture that kind of lays out in more detail some of the components that we think are needed for next generation security.
Yeah, very cool. So that was a great overview. Thanks very much. I'm not sure everyone is very familiar with all of the total vision, but we do want to talk about software-defined workflows more in detail because that's what tonight's about. I'd like to hear from Annie and from Daniel if you can talk about what software-defined workflows mean to you.
Sure. And Jim touched on it a little bit where he said that machines start having the capability of talking to each other, right? And that's what we're really trying to enable with the software-defined workflows. But in order to do that, you have to have some sort of framework. So I actually I do have some slides. Sorry, no, everyone's probably super tired of slides at this point, but it'll be more helpful to show you some pictures and things like that. So let me start this up here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're using software-defined workflows at Universal. We're just starting to get into it. And this is all based upon the MovieLabs paperwork that they just released. So Jim mentioned the recent paper on software-defined workflows. I'm just going to give you a crash course on it. So, but you should actually try to read it if you can. It's actually relatively easy to read. There's these 4 components from a software-defined workflow standpoint that you should be aware of. This would be task, asset, relationships, and participants. And the idea is with software-defined workflows is if you know these 4 different areas and the relationships between each other, actually I guess it's 3 areas and relationships between them, you actually can then really start to have machines be able to understand each other and be able to do things. And that's what we want. We want to try and automate things as much as possible. So an example of a task would be like syncing a picture and sound, or maybe you have to do color correction, or maybe you're doing transcoding. An asset would be just what you think it would be, like a camera file or maybe production sound. Relationships would give you the context as to what you are doing with that task and asset. Is this, what you're making, is it for dailies or is it for editorial? Is it a circle take? Where does this need to go after you make the file? So all of the context is really important as to about this asset and the task. And then of course you have the participants, the people that are involved with doing it, say like a dailies colorist or maybe an operator that's doing the transcoding. So each person actually has specific needs and context, in order to do their job. We're going to first focus on these first 3, and I'll kind of break down sort of how we look at this task, asset, and relationships, and then I'll throw back in the participant when we talk about ontologies. So as I mentioned, task is really a step in a workflow that's performed by a human or a machine. An asset is an item that is either consumed or produced by a workflow step. And the relationship is the conceptual person, place, or thing that can be associated with the task, asset, or another relationship. So to try and make that more real, we could say from a live action standpoint, there's something called a VFX turnover, where you have to turn over a whole bunch of different assets in order for a visual effects vendor to be able to create their CG, their computer generated visual effects for it. So in our case, we could say the task is create a VFX shot. And so in this case, it would be connecting the various assets that are associated with the single shot that requires visual effects work that a VFX vendor will work on. Our asset could be an HDRI photo, or it could be a reference photo. You'll see I have a bunch of different versions of assets, but an asset that is captured on set needs to be ingested into a database and associated with a specific shot or scene. And then the context, a lot of times visual effects teams will use something called the visual effects shot ID. It's a unique identifier specifically for a shot that will be worked on for visual effects. So just to kind of diagram this out, we have this concept of, you have this create visual effects shot, which is a task. And then it's going to produce an asset, which is the completed visual effects shot. But in order to do that, you have to have all of these items to actually bring in as reference for the visual effects vendor. So the HDRI photo, maybe LiDAR scans, reference photos from set, maybe 3D models, and also your camera EXR plates. And then again, as I mentioned, you'd want to know like, well, what shot are we talking about? Well, that would be the VFX shot ID that would give you the context as to what that shot is. So you can see that all of these tasks and assets are related to each other along with the context in order to provide the most amount of information for the actual task or the company or person doing things. And then we, just to give you sort of an idea on how we would put this in a machine, we've been working with DreamWorks to figure out how exactly we would actually show this in a UI. We actually have JSON files that show the relationship, but obviously it's really hard to look at and hard to parse. So we're working on a UI where we can actually see the relationship. So this is just kind of an example of the things that we're working on. So in this case, it's basically taking what you just saw and putting it into a JSON, which is now spitting out a UI that is showing you here that we have this, idea of this session, right? It's creating the visual effect shot. And within that session, you have a task, which is to create the VFX shot. And the output of that would be this VFX shot here in the middle. But then you'll see these inputs that come into there from the HDRI photos, the LiDAR scans, reference photos, all those things that were on the left-hand side and going in. And then we have a concept we call it meta entities. That is actually the context or the relationships. And so the VFX shot ID would be considered a meta entity that gives a description of what this is about. So another way of looking at it too, because meta entities are the pieces that are really interesting, because this is where you really want to be able to understand your relationships and your context. So another couple of screen grabs of some early designs that we've got going from a meta entity standpoint or the context. So we can kind of see it. It's kind of like almost like a Mac columns browser, but the idea is like you would have maybe a couple different meta entities that you're interested in. So maybe you're like clicking on show. Well, the show has a whole bunch of related items to it, like a character or creature or location, for example. If you click on character, you'll then see the relationships that are related to the character, like the actor, for example. Click on the actor, and then there's other choices like, is it a stunt double or, another stand-in? Are there other, what's the character name for that actor as opposed to just the actual actor? And then on the right-hand side, we can actually see the parent-child relationship and the hierarchy and like how these different items are related to each other. So, in this future world here that we're getting towards, where we are using software-defined workflows and you are planning to have these relationships between all of these things, you need a way to basically be able to modify them. And so this is, part of the system that we're actually designing in order to try and make it easier for people to do those relationships. Let's see here. So then let me talk about how we get the people back into this whole thing. Of course, you have to have a common language in order for machines to be able to speak to each other and utilize these software-defined workflows. So we have this concept, we call it interchange at Universal. But it's part of the MovieLabs principles, principle number 9, and it's mentioned as like the interface layer in the MovieLabs 2030 vision paper. But the idea is like having an open and extensible registry of this metadata and like having these field name equivalencies. So we think that machines can talk to each other better if they can map what they know into what the other system knows and what they're called, and kind of basically, mapping those together so that they can actually talk to one another. And we think that there's many common connected ontologies that we can actually create in order for those relationships to be availed to those systems. So I know that's a lot of words. It probably doesn't make any sense, but let me break it down here. So ontologies, that is basically looking at the relationships in a domain within a complex system. And it does depend on the participant. So let me give you some examples. So let's say you're a head of a studio, and you're highfalutin that way. Yeah, you got lots of other things on your mind about running the business and all that stuff. Well, you may be just interested in very high level pieces of the movie that you're creating. So, for example, you might be interested in like, what stories are we telling? Who's going to be doing these things? Like, we can call it construction or production of that movie. How are we going to distribute that? Who's it going to go to? How are we going to market it, right? So you're looking at things from a much higher level, but of course it's because you are looking at it from a studio head standpoint. If we drill down a little bit and we're looking at maybe a visual effects producer, you're going to be more interested in making that visual effect shot, right? And making all these shots and making them right. So you're going to be interested in well, how am I going to get information from editorial, and how am I going to get that, get the stuff to the DI vendor so I can get my plates? And what about the VFX vendor and keeping them on budget and all of the stuff? So you're going to be more interested in the process that's needed in order to create your visual effects shots and making sure that the VFX supervisor is getting everything that he or she needs. Now, if you're drilling down a little bit more, if you have someone that's like a visual effects on-set asset curator or data wrangler, that person's really just interested on getting the shots that they need, getting the metadata into the system, making sure that they have like perhaps like, you know, the right, it's associated with the right shoot day and the right scene, and like really drilling down into the actual metadata. So I know these are all eye charts, but the idea here is like, depending on who you are, you're going to have different ideas on what's important to you, but you'll see that even like across like film and TV and other content creation, there's just some basic workflows that we all do that we can actually define as the ontologies for how we work. And so the idea is if we can define those basic common ontologies and we can then import them into systems, the systems can actually talk to each other and really start working together in these software-defined workflows. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm happy to answer questions about that because I know it's kind of a meaty, crazy, abstract topic. But we are actually doing a lot of this over at DreamWorks right now, and we are in the process of taking the DreamWorks system and modifying it for live action. Starting with visual effects, hence the reason why I have all this visual effects stuff. But the idea is we are actually going to expand it out to the different production assets, such as editorial, camera files, dailies, and finishing. Finishing's far out, but that is on the goal. But the idea here is like we are working towards the MovieLabs 2030 vision. So hopefully that made sense.
Totally. And Andy, I'm just going to ask you something off the cuff. I know we didn't rehearse this at all, but one of the things, it sounds like you've got this giant database and you're kind of filtering them into views as to what's important for the intended viewer. But one of the things I think that really makes a difference is that the studios can often be siloed. So how do you convince a studio that they ultimately through marketing and all these other areas can save money? Because you know how often something is reproduced again and again and again because they don't know that asset is already created.
Absolutely. I know that quite well. So this is it. I don't know if it's a timing thing or what, but it is interesting at Universal where everyone just sort of realized like, okay, we've got all these, needs for repurposing the assets, like 3D models or, just assets from on set and everything. But we really, we didn't have a great system. Daniel probably knows because he used to work at Universal as well. And it's not just Universal. I mean, I was at Disney and, I will just say it wasn't great there either. And so everyone's got a problem with production assets and trying to find them and organize them. It's just because that we just never really had to repurpose them before, right? So it's like just putting them away and having them in the archive, that was good enough, and yeah, okay, maybe it took a little bit of time to find the editorial files for the sequel, right? But whatever. But now it's getting to the point where you are getting a lot of people asking for it. You have marketing activations that are in VR or AR, and you need all these things. And so the good thing at Universal is like, I think we all kind of came to the conclusion that, hey, so this production asset, we could use a little bit better organization perhaps. And if we could do that, it could really help downstream, like in marketing, for example, like you hit, but also like downstream in the distribution area, when we have this whole concept that if we can organize these production assets, relate them together and back to the script and the schedule, then you suddenly can open up all of this really wonderful information, right? And you can also then enable data analytics, machine learning. I mean, that's really part of the MovieLabs vision is to like connect all of this digital stuff, right? Really enable the fact that you're digital native and then be able to then connect everything and make things magical. And so, one of the things that we're always saying is like, hey, downstream, it's like if you need trivia pieces, for example, I mean, just think about all the great stuff that you can get from the notes from on set or like why certain things were picked, and that sort of thing. And utilize that downstream in some fun way for the consumers. And all you really need to do is just get your production assets in order and have them in a, related kind of manner. So, like I said, I don't know I'd love to just say it was all me just walking around asking people for their pain points, and but it did. I think it also helped. Like it was just the timing that people just started seeing it, that it would be really useful. So yeah, we have a lot of folks on our side that are all on board with this concept. And we have TV just waiting in the wings, like hoping that everything works out just fine, so they can just take it, So, but it's been a long time coming. I mean, we spent. I've been at Universal for 3 years, and that whole time we've been working out, this system, and we're actually about to start developing it finally after doing a whole bunch of planning, and we'll see later this year. But I'm really excited about where we're going with it.
It's a huge undertaking. I know that there's been a lot of efforts, you going back at least a studio, if not two, where you've got these large franchises. I know it's the golden dream, but there's so much that has to come together to get it all done. It seems almost insurmountable.
Yeah, you just break it down into little pieces.
The pieces. Yep.
Yeah. And like I said,
Crawl, walk, run.
We decided. Sorry, I didn't want to monopolize this whole panel, but it's all about me.
I'm calling on Daniel next.
Yeah. But we actually started specifically with visual effects, because the visual effects team we knew had pain points. They also understand technology. They're always on the cutting edge with everything. And we thought, here are kindred spirits here. They see the manual process. I used to work at Marvel, so I know a lot of the manual labor that was involved in putting those movies together. And so if we could do anything to kind of speed things up, it would basically be like organizing these assets in a better way than having some person like try to remember where they put it in which folder on which, SAN and, all that stuff. It's ridiculous. We need to move on to something better. Totally.
Daniel, I'm going to call on you now. So listen, COVID's been tough on everyone, right? So, a year ago at the tech retreat, when I don't think anyone, even though we kind of knew something was happening, but we weren't obviously in lockdown yet, there is a silver lining in all this, right? There's been an acceleration there. But someone actually said at the tech retreat, wow, this 2030 vision, 10 years away, we're here. Now, we're not there all the way. We've got this long ramp, right? A long on-ramp. How is this different? What are you doing at Sony? And what have you seen as far as the acceleration and adoption, and how has that changed, in your words, due to COVID?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that we started with was editorial. And that really kind of, when COVID hit, we had a lot of things that were in production, and basically, production couldn't start up, but we had stuff that was in post-production that were asking questions like, well, how do we get back up and running, even though we can't be at a studio or a physical location? So we partnered with Avid, partnered with Microsoft, and built this Avid in the Cloud platform. And that really was kind of the genesis of, at least Sony's big migration to the cloud in terms of actually doing work up on the cloud. And so as people got used to working in the cloud, it became kind of less of an issue in terms of, having things like a physical Avid at editor's desk. But what also happened was, okay, as we went through the editorial process, it's like, okay, now what? We've got VFX shots and other things to process. How do we do those? So we actually had a system that we were using before for some of the virtual production. It basically is called Tiburon, and it basically pulled together different elements. So for VFX shots where you had witness cam, maybe you had depth sensing camera information, and in addition to your main camera, it would kind of corral all those assets, rename them if needed into some standardized naming format, and then move them along. We realized we could adapt that to a cloud platform and basically allow editorial to kind of be the traffic cops, if you will, for determining what shots need to go to VFX, and being able to have a system basically automated, so that way you can actually pull the actual, you go back to the original camera negatives, transcode those into whatever format that VFX needed, whether it be DPX or EXR, send them over to the VFX house, and let them work with it. So that, with COVID, that really moved and accelerated that along. I mean, if you asked me a year ago, we'd be editing in the cloud. Today, I probably would say no way, but with COVID, we've got 2 features in the cloud now, and some other features interested.
Yeah, it really forced.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a really good point, Daniel. I think before we even knew what this MovieLabs vision was or this progression, I think a lot of us were realizing that a lot of these human jobs like pulling off LTO, transcoding, send to somebody. I know I've worked at several companies where we had these VFX polls. I think that was some of the first thing is often I would do a bid for a studio and they would come back and say, wait, why are we 15% over on everything? Well, you ordered all these clip polls. How come that wasn't in the bid? Well, we don't know what you're going to do. So
Right.
it made a lot of sense to say, well, wait a minute, that assistant editor knows exactly what they need. Why do they have to relay it to somebody, to relay it to somebody else, to do this manual operation, to send it? That's something that was a quick win. Now, I'm not saying it took overnight to do, but that rationale made sense.
Yeah, exactly. And we, just like you said, we basically put the editor as traffic cop, allowed for authentication and authorization, and basically it really allowed authorized people to be able to access the content and also do some validation. So now you no longer have to send an entire LTO tape worth of data. You can actually pull the actual clips, even just using time code in and time code out, and they get the specific sequences or frames that they need.
Right, exactly. Just a file trim. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Very cool. So Jim, so ontologies. I don't think I've ever heard the word ontologies said so many times outside of medical school. But what else is MovieLabs doing to make the vision software-defined workflows a reality?
So we're working in a number of areas. So we do have a number of ontology groups that we're kicking off related to things such as the contexts that Annie mentioned that are so important for breaking down work. We're also doing a little bit of work on something as maybe primitive as file naming. We did a project with the ETC on file naming for VFX image sequences. We're doing some work with the studios and Skywalker Sound on some naming conventions for sound files. Our goal there is not that the naming is a kind of an end in its own, but it also really gets into what are the key metadata elements that are the identifying characteristics of some of these assets, and so that in turn then feeds back into the ontology work. There also are a number of things related to trying to make things work across on-prem and cloud, across different clouds. I think asset management, there's some things there that need to change, maybe from kind of the monolithic systems that we see today. If you have assets that are scattered across different clouds also, you need to have ways to reference those assets in a way that is independent of their location, because you're going to have copies that are created as working copies or for performance reasons, local cache copies. And you want to have a common way to refer to them, but then be able to have that URI or whatever it is be resolved into, where's the closest version of that, and also then manage all of the access controls around it, right? If you're going to be having a security model, I think we're looking for, which is, we're moving from a place where, a lot of the access controls around assets were kind of a side effect of the fact that they got moved from one department to another, from one facility to another. And here, at least in the 2030 vision, the ideal is that the assets don't move. And so if the assets don't move and people are going to be accessing them from all over the place, not only do you need a new security architecture, but you also need to have the access controls that kind of follow the who's approved to access this thing at this particular point in time. And I see one of the questions in the chat from Carrie Rubin was, are we looking at tools for authorization for use in production materials? And yeah, obviously, you have something which has not been approved, that's a much smaller audience that can see it once it has been approved, which may, in the case of editorial, actually, trigger, that VFX pull. And so all of that gets back into the security. So we're doing a lot of work on the security architecture as well.
Yeah, Jim, at Sony, we kind of refer to what you just said as bringing the workflow to the data.
Yeah,
as opposed to the data moving around the workflow.
exactly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also when it comes to the data management side, like you said, is using hash lists. The ASC has a media hash list that we've been working on for a while. And so that you don't always have to have the data present. You can have an abstract of the data or know where that data is and know instantly that regardless of the file name, that is the same file that you're looking for. And you're not, duplicating or copying, huge volumes of data when all you really need is 2 files in a change list.
Yeah.
Hey, Greg.
Very cool. Very cool. Yes, Annie.
I forgot to bring up something at the end of my rant about the ontologies. So let me bring it back to ontologies again. So I saw a question was posed about this. I forgot to mention that these ontologies that I was just showing, right? This concept of industry ontologies, that really does need to be an open type of a set of data. So we, at Universal, we believe strongly in this concept of having industry ontologies and this interchange concept. And the only way we feel like we were going to be able to achieve that is by having, the industry work together on it. So we've really tasked MovieLabs to, take a look at that. And so there was a question in there saying like, well, are the universal ontologies just unique to us? No, actually, we're donating all the stuff that we're doing, and there's more to come. But there's, we're donating that all to MovieLabs so that we can work together with the other studios and other partners outside of MovieLabs to come up with this concept of this industry interchange. We've been thinking about it for a really long time. And just in the last probably like 6 to 8 months, we've done a ton of work just thinking about like, well, how would this work in the world, with ontologies, and how would you download them and how would you change them and modify them? And so we do feel like, we're going to incubate the work at MovieLabs. But it probably, and Jim may have a perspective on this, but I was thinking like it probably makes sense that it would become an open standard or open source like thing. So maybe something that would go to the Academy Software Foundation, for example, for its final resting place. But right now, we're just trying to come up with ways to do this. And as I mentioned earlier, like the most simplest way is just mapping. So Jim, I hope it's okay to just mention about like some of the work that MovieLabs is doing, like with the camera metadata, for example. Like we've got a little project. Jim mentioned the sound naming work, but one of the things we're looking at is, and this might be interesting to you, Greg, and some of the ASC members that are out there. But we are looking at just mapping various camera metadata to each other because that seems like a pretty low-hanging fruit type of thing to help connect those different camera manufacturers together and create that common language, right? So I forgot to bring this up earlier, but the idea is like you would have sort of this definition of a thing, right? And then you map the various pieces of metadata from those other manufacturers to that thing, that definition. And you can have an industry name for it if you want to call it something, but then that gets people all riled up because they have to figure out like how to call it something. So if you have just the definition, right, of something like ISO, for example, like if you had that, and then everyone understands, oh, okay, you're talking about ISO, or you're talking about exposure index, or you're whatever they call it in their camera side of things. So that's kind of how it would work. And so we're going to test that out through MovieLabs to see if this concept seems to work.
Yeah, and
that makes
on.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, everything that we're working on, our goal is, for it to be open. In some cases, there'll be things that we'll publish on the MovieLab site, maybe open up GitHubs to facilitate some industry collaboration. If there are actually, open source things that mature as a result of this, we'd like to see them, migrate to a place like the Academy Software Foundation. There are opportunities, I think, for some of these things to that are more, microservices. There's a group in SMPTE that's working to standardize those in, one of the TCs there that I think the Open Services Alliance for Media with Chris Lennon is kind of operating as a funnel. But, all of these things, we think it's very important that they be, open, that they be developed in collaboration with the industry. And yeah, so we're trying to move everything to be open and common.
Yeah, to Andy, to your point, we're dealing with this right now. Obviously, you wearing your SciTech hat and me on my ASC side with our Advanced Data Management Committee, we now have this framing initiative. And this came out of our conversations with Chris Clark and others on the committees talking about the ACES metadata file. And we realized that we could take some of that burden on. So we do have this FDL, this framing decision list that we're working on. And to your point, but when you go to camera manufacturers and say, you should call it this, they'll say, well, no, we call it that. So having that map, absolutely, you got to have that Rosetta Stone. It doesn't really matter. ISO is EI, it's all the same.
Yep, exactly. And
Absolutely.
that's the thing. It's like that way people can just feel free to innovate, feel free to just call it whatever you want, right? It's totally fine. We don't need everyone to agree on the same term or use the same words. We just have to agree on that thing, what is that thing?
Yep.
What's the definition of it? And then cool, and then now we know, what you call it. Cool. That's what I call it over here. And now I can get it into a database, for example. And, we think it'll work, but we will see later this year.
Yeah,
yes,
there's still
absolutely.
And to that point, there's still opportunity to go back to the vendors and tell them, like Greg suggested, you should maybe name it this instead. And we hope that some of the vendors will be, receptive to that and make some changes. So we don't have to map everything, but yeah, the other thing that gets me excited, the other project on the MovieLabs side is this kind of standard iconography for workflows as well. So hopefully we can start to see kind of more standardized symbols being used across productions for workflows.
Yeah, I've seen your workflow charts. They're pretty amazing.
Yeah, we've been doing some work there. Actually, it also really, I think, fits in very well with what Annie was talking about, in terms of the, the tasks, assets, participants, the context, because all of those are things that we're looking to, depict in this iconography, so that you can diagram out a workflow. You can look at it at different levels of detail, right? I mean, you can look at the the facility level, at the all the way down to the application, task, and individual asset level, because as I think Annie and Daniel mentioned, all of the departments, everyone has a different view on these things. They all have different needs in terms of what they need to understand in terms of what's happening, what's happening in the workflow and what the dependencies are.
Yep. Hey, if we can go to the Q&A, we've actually had some questions kind of coming up here. Was that Brian? Were you coming on?
Yeah, let me bring up a couple of questions. Not to be too satirical here, but it almost feels like a lot of questions out there as if, will MovieLabs 2030 vision correct all the human errors and stupidity that goes on without planning or anything regard to naming and file convention? So I don't think that gets addressed here, but no, let's jump into some of the real questions. A lot of questions came up regarding the definitions of some of these standards. So besides laying out a workflow, will there actually be APIs and definitions defined to these workflows that could be standardized? Will there be AI tools that can automate, that can be passed down to other people's workflows to allow full integration with workflows? There's 2 or 3 questions that sort of address that, but can you maybe address that in a broader sense? What is MovieLabs producing besides a vision? Is there actually APIs and corresponding workflows that people can adopt?
The goal to facilitate, this improved interoperability and ability to, change workflow pipelines, reconfigure tools more easily. We're kind of starting, as Annie mentioned, with I think the most fundamental thing is, which is you need to have some commonality on your vocabularies, your data models, the things that you're going to be exchanging, between, some of these, hopefully, more automated things to support collaboration and automated processing in the workflows. If you don't have that, you're not going to get anywhere. So I think it's building up from data model up to maybe some of the interaction paradigms. So we think, for example, something like a message bus with a pub sub model that would allow, when something is published or approved, for that to go out, and then, authorized recipients can look at those messages and then take their own actions, whether manual or automated. And so agreeing on some of these contexts that are probably a lot of the basis for subscribing to stuff. You're going to be subscribing to things, based upon, the shot or the VFX sequence, the character that you're working on animating. Moving up from that, yeah, we think there are opportunities to standardize the payloads more, maybe more specifically. You can then move all the way up to APIs where you might be saying, well, this is going to be done, using an AMQP message or a particular HTTP REST API. I think it's going to vary from area to area, but we're first focusing on I think some of the data model aspects. In the security side, we think there may be a need for a common language for describing some of the security access policies around these assets and how they relate to tasks and participants. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do, and ideally, you would get to the point where you would define an API, but at a minimum, you'd like to be able to make it a lot easier for people to put in shims and API adapters between some of the the existing tools, if we're starting to talk at least about the same things that we've defined in the ontology and the data models.
To that point, are you thinking about or building any tools for the authorization or use of production materials like content, management tools that will actually, if you identify an asset, from a rights standpoint?
I think the goal of maybe a policy description language would get into, who has access to what and when and for what purpose. There are already a lot of existing interfaces and protocols for, authentication, for, token-based authorization, for, short-term access to an S3 bucket. I think the places where we would look maybe to add value, and some of these places where we think that workflow management systems are going to need to be talking to security systems, because if you have your assets staying in one place in the cloud or even being transferred, your access control policies and when an asset may need to be copied or moved, it all needs to be driven from the workflow. And so all of the workflow scheduling systems at a lower level, the workflow orchestration systems really need to drive security. They need to drive storage orchestration. And I think in some of these places where there are interfaces between very industry specific things about workflow and these more generic areas of storage management and security policy management, that's probably a rich area for us to try to get to some more commonality on interfaces and maybe move all the way up to that API level.
Yeah, and to kind of add to that, Jim, at Sony, we, like I said, we have this system called Tiburon, and so we have it in the cloud on Microsoft Azure's cloud platform. However, Tiburon and kind of the rest of Sony's kind of cloud platform rests in AWS. So Amazon's a big partner of Sony, and so we've had that same kind of challenge with security as well as kind of data interchange between the clouds. So we effectively have a multi-cloud setup now, and trying to figure out where assets reside, because you don't want the same assets sitting in each cloud because you're just going to be paying double the cost. So we've done a lot of work to figure out, okay, well, how do we make sure these assets live in one cloud, and maybe kind of byproducts of these assets can flow to the other clouds and then downstream to the necessary parties that need to work with them.
Like ACES and SMPTE and other open bodies that talk about workflows and standards, how has MovieLabs addressed, or what's their expectation for downstream with vendors being able to contribute back in terms of the ontology and the structure of the database to pass off metadata to be able to hand things off in a structured way? Is there guidelines in the vision to actually provide that? This kind of goes back to the API question, but there are several questions sort of leaning to this information about automation and AI and what your plans are, how you're communicating with vendors to actually build that into the structure of the vision.
Yeah. So We're currently, and this is an approach that we do frequently, is we work with our studio members to understand their priorities and try and get some alignment on a vision level, and then work on getting some straw man, some draft proposals, some starting points to engage in wider groups. And I think as far as the engagement with a lot of the industry partners, I mean, we're already having a lot of one-on-one conversations with all the three major cloud platforms, with some of the larger post houses that build a lot of this infrastructure, with a lot of the software vendors, the tool vendors that build the editing tools, the VFX tools, because all of them, we're going to need buy-in from all of them. And so I think as we move forward, we're probably expecting that, at least in MovieLabs, we'll start maybe informally, bringing together some roundtables with some of the interested industry participants to discuss some of these things, figure out who wants to work on what, where, do we think that this is something that should go to SMPTE? Do we think this, is something that we should have a cross-industry kind of working group on? And so, we're looking at a lot of different models for collaborating with the industry on a number of the different areas. On the AI level, currently we don't have projects specifically in AI. I know that the Open Services Alliance for Media, I think, has some interest in looking at some microservices in that area. I think there also is a SMPTE ETC joint task force, and also I think this with the EBU that was just recently launched. I think Eve Berquist is contributing to that. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of industry groups that are working on this, and we're all trying to make sure that we work collaboratively in parallel, and where there are areas where we need to synchronize, that we're taking care of that communication.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Actually, Roberto Schaefer just, I don't know, Ryan, if you're going to talk about that, but perfect dovetail into that is Roberto's comment. You want to follow up on that? Yeah. Basically, we've been speaking with certain groups, and I'm sure you guys have heard this many times. Oh, we're working on the same thing. So Roberto's working with the Imago technical committee, and they are having very similar issues, and they would like to confab and work together on this.
This is a question maybe for Annie, sort of putting on your post-production hat, and Daniel. But there was a certain cost to ingest in the past, with tape and film. As this data set is enabled into the cloud and the metadata moves over, it feels like the short-term impact will be a little higher cost of, to post, because you're having more of a higher level of engineering. But where do you see the vision taking it over the next 10 years in terms of where this effect is on the operational expenses for this type of new facility in the cloud? Where do you see the model going? Does it start to increase cost, but you can do more work, or do you feel that cost will actually be cheaper in the long run because there's less of a facility model? Where do you see that vision going operationally?
I can step in really quick, Annie, if you don't mind. With the experience we've had with the two productions kind of edited in the cloud, yeah, we definitely noticed an increase in cost. And I know there was another question earlier in the chat about OpEx, and we certainly saw that OpEx kind of increase by a lot. But what offset that was another OpEx, or lack of OpEx expense, was the lack of having to rent facilities, right, for the post team. Because traditionally they either will edit on the lot, or they'll have a facility that's rented for them. And so because of COVID, and because they couldn't come to a facility, we actually saved on that cost. And it's not just the facility rental, but it's everything that comes with it in terms of utilities and having to stock it with supplies and things like that. So we did see kind of an increase in storage costs, but a decrease in other areas. But also just working and trying to figure out how to tier the storage as well, because if you put everything on kind of the faster premium storage, it's gonna cost and drive cost up really quickly. But if you could put stuff that you either are not using, or if you already completed, push it down, like with Avid, they have what's known as a nearline. That is a lot, like I think 10% the cost of their online storage, Nexus storage. So it's one way to kind of manage the cost. It certainly takes a lot more management, whereas before you would have a group of editors and all the data was on a centralized physical Nexus. Now you have to have a little more management between the different types of buckets, if you will.
But that's a perfect application, if you would, for a software-defined workflow. From your cut, you could tell what's
Right.
needed to be. You'll tear that up. Everything else that's not necessary can go to a lower cost storage. And through AI and through other tools you can integrate in there, that could get really quick, really intelligent. The other side, there was a couple of questions. It seems that integrations between different workflows, from color pipelines to the problems with audio and the audio issues that come up with it. Where does the software-defined intelligence of these workflows fix those problems? It still seems like at the end of the day, we always have to still fix problems in post due to issues that come in production. But it seems like there's a lot of questions that are arising of, do we see more automation, more of these things being able to be corrected without that touch point of a headcount actually getting in there to fix it? Or is that never a reality in post? What's your experience on the two shows on the cloud so far?
Yeah, so,
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Daniel.
I was gonna say, audio seems to be kind of like the forgotten thing, right? Especially when it comes to like an editor wanting to do a remote session with their director and being able to show them that, whatever sequence they're working on. It's really hard. Who would have thought to have frame synced audio? And so there have been a few platforms that have been working towards enabling that. And I hope that work will continue. But yeah, audio and being able to color grade 10 bit at least remotely is also a big challenge. And so I'm hoping that there'll be some innovation around those areas. I wish I could say we were working on stuff specifically besides this virtual mixing environment that we have. But yeah, when it comes to color, it's kind of a wait and see, at least from my point of view.
Yeah, and from my point of view, I feel like that you can't get rid of the human element, right? There's just, I mean, it'd be great if there is a way to do that. And I think we're really trying to do with these software-defined workflows is basically create this foundation of being able to do these sort of workflows and get things into the cloud and move the data around as we need to from the tiers and have applications come to it, right? So there's a lot that we have to do from a foundational standpoint. And then once we get that done, then we can kind of look and see like what sort of opportunities do we have. Maybe there's ways for machine learning, for example, to kind of help find patterns or find issues, especially when you maybe identify a problem with maybe like a certain camera, but you didn't do a great job at organizing that data, for example. So maybe you could, there's a way to utilize machine learning to kind of help, find all of those shots that were done with that camera. I know I vaguely recall a problem like that happening on one of our movies somewhere down the line. But I think that's the thing. It's like this whole concept of software-defined workflows. I mean, I think that what's great about this audience is that they're all thinking about like, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it's like, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, look, I'm just trying to get the basics set up so that we can actually get going and hopefully solve some of these issues. So it's great that people are thinking like, well, how is this going to help? I mean, for us, for example, I'll just give you an example of like how we're planning to utilize this, and we're hoping that we'll see great efficiency. And the thing is too, is like, it's difficult, I think, when it comes to manual labor to actually equate that into cost savings, because it's like you're saving people time. You're saving, they're able to now do other things, but how do you actually, equate that to some of these cost savings here? So for us, really, with the way, one of the things that we felt, and I kind of touched on it with the slides, which, by the way, I can provide the slides. I probably have to take out the UI pieces because that's not a final thing, but I'm happy to provide the rest of the slides if anybody wants, as I saw that was a question. One of the things that we're looking at is, as I mentioned, is like there's this process of when you're turning over to a VFX vendor and you have all of these assets from on set. They could be like reference photos. People took, references of like things because they're going to have to do like a set extension in visual effects. They just need to understand what kind of lighting was used. So they have these things called HDRIs that are taken to kind of get lighting reference, for example. So typically it can take, if you're turning over 100 shots to a visual effects vendor, I mean, we've heard that it can take, anywhere from like half a day to over a day just for someone to sit there and sift through folders of files. It gets worse when you have, maybe somebody that was on production that organized the folder structure, and now somebody new came in from the visual effects team, now taking over that organization and not really understanding how those, somebody else organized the data, but that's what you get. And so this is sort of that manual labor that I was talking about. And so for us, really, we want to start from the beginning when people are starting to ingest in their files. And again, the ontology thing that we're talking about, just to kind of put it in people's heads how this is going to work. The plan is that we would have this show ontology. And we're coming, and Universal's coming up with a version that again, like I said, we'll be happy to donate to MovieLabs to keep the work going. But it has a whole bunch of relationships and prior things, and then also being able to ingest in the schedule for the day. So like call sheets, for example. And being able to get all that data in. And then the way we see it is that the system would automatically then have information for the person that's ingesting those assets. They're taking photos from on the set. Well, we already know like where they're at, right? And what they're supposed to be shooting and what the scene numbers are that they're supposed to be doing out of the script, right? So all of that information just helps prevent human error from happening. Like you were just saying, like, the human element. Well, getting data in and getting metadata in there properly is one of our things that we're like, well, how can we prevent, human error? So the idea is like, if you just can have pull downs with, all of these different choices, sure, we can eventually give them like free form fields, right, to text in. But if you can just pull down and get the right version, right piece to tag the data in, right, that actually helps prevent some of that human error that propagates through the rest of the system. So hopefully that gives you a little idea of like where we're kind of headed, is just, trying to reduce the human error, trying to reduce the manual labor that's needed, being able to then relate these assets to one another and back to the script and the schedule, for example. And then, being able to find things that would be helpful. So that's sort of the basis of what we're planning to do with our system. And then just going back to Brian's earlier question, because I'm glad Daniel answered from his perspective about the cost. I will tell you from my part, we are just building the system. So we have actually not put any productions on it. We're planning to put a production on this platform that we're talking about, probably around the June timeframe. So we'll get a lot of feedback for the rest of the year after that, and I'd be happy to come back and tell you guys and girls how things are going. But in the meantime, I'm super concerned about cost. I think personally that we need to have a come to Jesus moment with all the cloud providers and come up with a better business model for how production is going to work in the cloud, because I don't think that the existing ways that we do distribution in the cloud are going to work cost model wise for production.
Yeah, but it comes with Amazon Prime Video subscription, so
well, then maybe it's okay then. That's all right. Yeah. So I mean, I think that I just feel like there needs to be more research, and it's great that Daniel and I think some of the other studios have already started doing, putting stuff into the cloud, taking it out of the cloud, finding it was too expensive. But I think there is, as we're starting to work more in the cloud, one of the issues that we have working in the cloud is like, we were, because we're focused on visual effects. And so this kind of question came up of like, well, how much IO do you need from your, visual effects server, if it was up in the cloud? And I'm like, I don't know. We don't track that sort of thing. We don't actually look to see how many times somebody like takes out data and puts in data. It's free because it's a NAS that's sitting, like on-prem with the visual effects team, and they just grab stuff however they want. So there is no thought for that. So now we have to think about that as it up in the cloud, and now it's going to be $1 million. It's just, we have to talk. We got.
I was going to say that's a good point, Andy, because one thing we found, especially like with Amazon, where, I mean, you go down to like the transaction level, right? And you get charged per transaction. So now if you're in a frame-based workflow, what does that mean if you're uploading individual frames? And so it's like that, like, okay, we've got to batch these frames and put them in a wrapper. So it appears as one transaction as opposed to several. So it's watching out for those little gotchas.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. We also need, like, for the clever people out there, we do need a way to stream high quality, and I mean high bit depth, color accurate EXRs from the cloud. So if anybody can figure that out, that would be great, because I could use that in the next few years. Thank you.
So it sounds like baby steps, but you're all moving in the right direction. Do you really ideally see being able to eventually deploy a cloud infrastructure directly from a software-defined workflow? I mean, something like Terraform, where you could lay it out, breadboard it out. Now, some of the things you described, some of these intermediate things like a NAS on-prem versus that, how do you define those and then, and have them be on location and in the cloud? It still seems like some connecting the dots, but it's moving in that direction, and that's how you plan to do your work going forward, or how do you?
Yeah. I mean, my plan, we'll see if it actually comes to fruition. So we're completely on-prem right now for all of our live action productions. So my plan is just to get us into a hybrid environment, right? So, and that's what I'm saying is like starting like in June, this time period, like just starting this little baby step thing, because it's a change management thing too as well, right? There's a whole bunch of things besides cost. I mean, there's a lot of questions. We just can't guarantee connectivity. That's another problem I think that we have. And so I think in the next, like, for at least from our standpoint, the next 3 years, we should get really good at a hybrid environment, for example, where we still have stuff that's on-prem and then you have stuff in the cloud. Again, I have to play back, 3K or 4K EXR sequences, with color accuracy and 12-bit. So, I can't do that from the cloud right now, right? So you have to have the on-prem capability to do that sort of thing. But the idea is like, maybe you can at least start backing up into the cloud, right? We can start actually doing those relationships that I was talking about in the cloud. I could provide a DI vendor access to my Azure subscription, and they can now, access the camera files and do their polls, that we need to be done. There's all these cool kind of things that start happening when you start working in the cloud, but because connectivity and the cost thing and just the playback of those high quality files, it's the limiting factor. But I think probably in like 3 to 5 years, could we actually start switching it out? And now the single source of truth for the data is actually up in the cloud. And then maybe just the on-prem is just like a dummy copy, replication version of it that just gets synced to that single source. I think it's totally possible. I'd like to get to the MovieLabs vision by 2025. So I'm actually pushing really hard that we're gonna get there. And I mean, just as long as we get to like just starting it, like all in the cloud would be great. But yeah, I mean, we have some challenges. We have change management. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to happen. So it's just not gonna be overnight, unfortunately. But there are things we can do to work towards that, concept. And again, we need these pieces, right? The interchange capability. We need these ontologies. We need all of this stuff to form a foundation so that we can actually get to that nirvana out there. And it's going to take a little bit of time, but I feel like we're making some really good progress. And then, along with all these other groups, I mean, MovieLabs is obviously focused on the 2030 vision, but there's all these other pieces, right? ACES plays a place. I saw Jay-Z asked if ACES is important to MovieLabs. Like the ASC and AMPUS. I mean, there's ETC, there's all these different groups, SMPTE. everyone's playing their part, because the whole idea of that MovieLabs vision was really to just kind of throw a target out there, right? And so far, people haven't gone like, boy, that's a stupid idea. Why would you do that, right? I mean, I think people are seeing the benefit of if we had this capability, right, where files stay, where they're at and applications come to them. We have this great security and maybe like production user IDs. And, wouldn't it be great to streamline, how people get access to their files and, and just make content in a really flexible way. It would be really awesome. But, as Jim was mentioning, there's a lot we have to do from a security standpoint to really get to that part too as well. So hence the reason why it takes time, but I think we can get there in baby steps.
And it does seem like go ahead, Greg.
No, it's okay. I know we're at 8:10. I think we were originally on these virtual meetings as opposed to the ones we have at the Academy that go on for 2.5 hours. Try to keep it down. I'll let until Linda grabs the noose and pulls it. We'll go. But actually, it's a good segue, Annie. You were talking about the security side. I know we're talking about software-defined workflows here, but Jim, can you talk a little bit about the proposed security architecture, because that's so important. The whole idea of safeguarding the data and having it be part of the architecture itself, rather than simply auditing a gateway.
Yeah, let me just very quickly show just a few slides here. So as I mentioned, we put out this additional white paper that double clicked on the security principles back in 2019, and just yesterday put out a first 3 parts of the security architecture. And just so people understand kind of the motivation and what's changing here, traditionally, the security model has been based upon perimeters. So you have a perimeter around your facility. It used to be physical perimeter. Now it's more of a network perimeter. And you go into cloud, hybrid cloud, and now, you kind of extend your network firewall to your VPC up in the cloud, but it's still a perimeter because most the stuff is still running under your control, the applications and such. So when you move to this model in the future, where we want to see the workflows in the clouds, the assets in the cloud, and basically, one of the goals here is to enable a worldwide workforce, diverse creative teams that don't need to have their own infrastructure. So they're going to be coming in from all over the place. You'll still have post houses and studios, and they'll have their perimeters. But their perimeters here, these red lines, they don't help you with the stuff that's up in the cloud, and you can't put a perimeter around everything. So we think that instead we're going to need to have this much more granular kind of zero trust model around the individual components that are in the workflow. So the notion is that every user, every device from the outside that accesses things in the cloud is going to need to be authenticated, but then separately and more importantly, the authorization for specific users to do specific tasks on particular assets, all of that's going to have to be managed much more dynamically, and it's going to need to be driven from the workflow. And so that really is where we think that a new security architecture is needed. And so if you look at the architecture white paper that we just published, it kind of breaks down some of the components that you need, both existing security support components for identity management and such that already exist, but also some domain specific things for this finer grained authorization, the authentication not just of users, but also of devices, of applications, of infrastructure. And then here on the left, a lot of the workflow management and scheduling systems and asset management systems actually driving and telling the security system in real time what policies it needs to enforce. So we think there's a lot of interesting work to be done here. and putting out the security architecture is kind of the first step in that.
That's great. Yeah, that's super important. And also, as far as talking collaboration, at the ASC Motion Imaging Technology Council, under my workflow committee, we do have a new subcommittee called Cloud Architecture. And some may wonder, why is the ASC concerned about this? And I think a lot of it is because it's not just about storage and processing. It's about having data that's manipulatable, or you can have raw data, you can have log data, and then you can have instructions on top of that. And so we really care about making sure that creative intent and the integrity of the vision is carried through all the way. And that involves cloud, that involves appliances near set. And so Jack Wenzinger and Mark Soren will be co-chairing that subcommittee. So we're looking forward to that work coming up.
Greg, Linda Rossner here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so here's my question to all these wonderful, wonderful panelists and yourself. Great job. Do we want to go another 15 minutes or do we want to wrap it up?
Who hasn't had dinner yet?
I think it's up to the audience. Are they tired of us?
Yeah.
Well,
That's
There's a lot of questions.
There are so many questions. We have at least 9 more questions. So I'll tell you what, people can go off. If you guys can hang on for another 15 minutes, I'm going to wrap it up at around 8:29, if that's okay for you all.
Yeah, I'm
Sure.
good.
Sure.
Okay,
Yep.
wonderful. And thank you all, attendees and panelists, and Greg and everybody.
I see a great question by Jay. How do you see these tools being used by young creators? My personal feeling is more so than not, because that's all they will know very soon.
That's right.
But put it out there, Annie.
Yeah. No, I think that's, part of our change management is the old guard, right? People that are used to working a certain way. But I've talked to a whole bunch of younger filmmakers before, and I'm really excited for them, because I feel like, look, if we can achieve even part of this vision, right, about, really making things streamlined, I think they really get the advantage of it, because that's all they'll know then, hopefully, right? So people that are just entering the filmmaking side of things now, they have to kind of learn the old school methods still. But I do think that, I mean, I know it sounds cliche, but I really feel like what we are defining with the MovieLabs vision is going to define filmmaking. And sorry, when I say filmmaking, I mean television too.
Yes.
As well, right? Yes. Okay. Filmmaking for like the next 100 years, right? Because we've really done kind of the same thing for like 100 years. I mean, yeah, we went to digital, and but we still are working in the old ways with film. So, I think, I think this whole concept, and the thing is like how we do software defined workflows is going to evolve from where we're at right now too as well, right? We're using microservices now. It used to be SOAs before, and it was like FIMS before. And, there was like always these versions, right? So it's always going to iterate and get better. But I think this concept of like seamlessly having, this technology backbone that people don't have to think about anymore, right? We don't have to have these, here you go, Leon Silverman, snowflake workflows every single time. Like, why can't we just have this common framework? People just create and they just tell their stories. We don't really need to have all this crazy pipeline setup and all that stuff. And yeah.
Well, the world's getting smaller. I mean, who's been on Facebook and looked at certain special groups, like, for instance, the virtual production work group?
Oh, yeah.
And you have these very young people that don't know what they're not supposed to know. And they show this and they go, come on, you didn't really create that in your bedroom. You had an army of people at IL working on that, right? And then they show you behind the screen, they don't. And they don't know what the MovieLabs vision is. They just know that they can do this. And as you start working with other artists, because other people will like what they do and say, hey, can you hit me up? Well, now all of a sudden, maybe they'll have a shared Perforce server. Maybe they'll be sharing data, and they don't know what this vision is, but they're just going to live it.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. Daniel.
I also feel our industry's changed where we are making 10x the amount of content we used to make 10 years ago. So having a vision like this to allow us to streamline our pipelines, to be more efficient, to be able to take we're not getting 10x the budget increase, we're getting 0% budget increase, but we got to make so much more content. So this vision is also about streamlining this 100 years of filmmaking and making sure we can continue for the next 100 years.
Yeah, Daniel, what else are you seeing at Sony? I mean, when some of the things come to my mind are things like histogram matching cameras, or spending a lot less time on matching color and more time on the creative side of color. Aces enables that. What else at Sony have you seen that's actually doing this?
I mean, aside from the color aspect, just like there's a new camera that came out, the A1, and with that was kind of lost in kind of all the big hoopla with the camera itself was this, this new Sony professional phone, right? And everybody asks, well, why do I need a professional phone and why is it so expensive? Well, one of the cool things about it, it's got integrated 5G. So it was interesting to see the reception online to some of that, because some of the content creators were like, the light bulb went off, and they were like, wow, so you mean I can actually film and live stream at the same time? I don't need to come back to the studio or my computer, ingest, and then push out. I can actually just do this live as I'm capturing, or even just push directly to the cloud, queue it up, and then have it kind of ready to go. So, the on-ramp to the cloud is getting a lot shorter, I feel, and kind of to tag on to some of Annie's points too. I think the younger creators that are coming out of school now, like you said, they don't know what they don't know. But it's also important that we as MovieLabs and as ASC and as SMPTE, we start to define some standards that these young creators can tap into. So we have these standards existing in the cloud, especially when it comes time to master and distribute the content. We're not stuck like, oh, well, you only shot that in Rec 709. You didn't use, these other kind of standards that would have enabled us to actually publish, Rec 2020 or what other new standards come out in the future. So I think it's very important, going forward that we get everybody on board with standardized way, at least in the cloud of doing things.
And when you don't have to think about it, you've done it right. I mean, look at the consumer side. Look, I can be on my phone. How many times have I half written an email, and then I sit down on my computer and I look, and there's an icon down there. I can push the button and my email is there, right? You download something to your desktop. Well, we all know the desktop was only on your machine, right? It's in the cloud now. So these are all things that we don't think about, and we just assume are going to be in everything we do. So I think when we cannot think about it anymore, we've succeeded. Jim, do you have any comments about that, about the seamless translation?
No, I think that's absolutely crucial and key. And I think the goal is that a lot of these, the automation of these things that when something gets approved or something is published and needs to be transcoded, that all of the stuff, it's going to happen ideally seamlessly. It's going to happen quicker. It's going to allow more time, because you'll be able to iterate. So you'll be able to get another iteration in, whereas previously you might not have. So I think but the devil's in the details, right? I mean, if the implementations are bad, the experience is going to be bad, and so we need to, I think, be very cognizant as we move forward that we'll need to work closely with the groups that are going to be implementing this, from some of the software vendors, to ensure that it really does live up to the potential.
Yeah, and I would add too, I mean, I at least from the universal standpoint, I mean, we really want to get away from the snowflake workflow thing, right? So having this platform that's extensible, right? Because you just mentioned Perforce, Greg. I mean, obviously game engine assets are becoming a thing, and like being able to like link into that, right, would be great. And I think as you always have all these different asset types that come about, you have to rejigger your asset management system again, right, to actually understand it. So, having an extensible platform that you can just then add in, say like a JSON schema, for example, of just what that is, that's actually the power of being able to, part of this software defined workflows concept is like having this extensible framework. Because in the future, maybe we'll have computational cinematography, we'll have like all these other types of ways of capturing in content for us to then tell our stories with. And you want to have a flexible system that can kind of handle that. And it's a little bit more future proof than having something that's hard coded.
Yeah.
Right.
And to add to that, and it was on a few of Jim's slides too. I really think it's important to focus on this abstraction layer, right? And make sure that's the extensible piece. That way, as new technologies develop, you can they have the kind of blueprint to be able to write their own APIs to this abstraction layer, so you don't have the backend processes having to switch out interfaces every couple of years. So
yeah, I mean the software engineering that you need just to say replace one tool and its plugin in your workflow. I mean it's terrible today, and you really, especially as the technology is changing so rapidly, and we've seen a lot of the 3D work. It was post, and well now it's previs, it's concept, it's storyboard, it's and if you need to, every time you need to reconfigure your workflow because you've moved the 3D modeling up earlier, or maybe we get to a point where the difference between the final rendered models and the ones that are used for real-time previs, maybe they don't need to be radically different. Maybe so. Every time technology advances, you want to be able to rework your workflow to take advantage of that and creatively. And as things happen faster and faster, we can't have all of this very fragile custom software that's used to integrate things.
And that's one of the things that we actually just don't have time. We can go on for another, I'm sure, 2 hours, but one of the things we did talk about is the fact that with the previs getting better and better and visual effects teams moving up ahead of the program into virtual production, the cloud is going to have to be enabling that. It has to. There's no way we can do this without that. And we've got teams worldwide. Every post facility, every studio now has production happening all over the world, and there's no way to enable that in the old way we were doing things.
Yeah, it's mentality of like in the past of the different groups being able to hand off, right? Once their work is completed, they kind of hand it off and they're like kind of done. In kind of this new frontier of cloud and software defined workflows, you don't have that anymore. Like work persists through the entire process, and so it's very important that we've got systems and processes in place to be able to manage all that.
Yeah, I just wrote in to someone saying like, look, cloud, it's just inevitable, right? I think we're all going that way and everything. So we just want to try and make it the best way possible for our productions, so that it makes sense. And then, these things are all linked together, right? Because the last thing we need is like, we have grandma's attic on our NAS on-prem. We don't need grandma's attic up in the cloud, where we can't find anything, right? So it is really key to try and, organize this ahead of time, get ahead of the curve, basically, because we know we're all heading in that direction. We just have to make it so that it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time. We're at 8:28. We got to, I think, most of the questions, maybe not all of them. Apologies for those we didn't get to. But like we said, I think we're going to make this a series. There's just too much to talk about. We haven't even gotten into things like union issues and wait, you're working at home? How do we track that? And wait, you have a file that you can edit and color and do sound in that application? How do we make sure that you don't step on someone's toe? I mean, there's so many things to talk about. We don't have time tonight.
Speaking of not having time tonight.
Nice.
I have asked I've asked our webinar tech, Chris Alvarez, who I thank very much, if he could save the questions so that if any didn't get answered, maybe we can send them to the panelists and they can answer them offline at your leisure, because I hate to have any of these questions go unanswered, because people have taken the time to sit in, and you all have taken the time to volunteer. We still have 80 participants on now. We went over, and so we had 21 viewers on headquarters at YouTube, five viewers on our own YouTube, 4 viewers on Facebook. So I thank everybody. Greg, I'm going to let you close it, but this has been fantastic, and I thank you all for this time. It's been a long time in coming. And so again, thank you all for your perseverance, your time, your expertise, and your knowledge. Greg, you can close it out.
Yes. Thank you, Linda. And you said it best. There's not much more for me to say other than thank you, Jim. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Daniel. That was fantastic. I really hope that we can continue this as a series. And at the rate you keep publishing papers, well, I guess we'll have to. But thanks again for showing up. And I just want to thank all of our sponsors as well. And on that note, how are we doing? 8:29 and a half. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Read the paper.
Ha!